Hej och välkomna tillbaka till Erik Penserbanks Temadag Life Science. Nu har det blivit dags för Ascelia Pharma och Waras Brogren, Chief Commercial Officer, som ska presentera bolaget. Kör hårt, Julie.
Ja, tack så mycket, Ludvig. I think I will do this in English, although down here in Malmö we practice our Danish and Swedish, but maybe my Swedish is mainly skånsk, although my Brogren last name is Swedish. So I think it's easy in English today. I hope you're having a nice day, and I'm looking forward to presenting Ascelia Pharma for you. So on the next slide, these are the terms of the forward-looking statements. On the following slide, about Ascelia Pharma. On the next slide, yes. So Ascelia Pharma, we work in orphan oncology. We identify, develop, and commercialize novel drugs that address unmet needs in rare oncology conditions. We have two compounds in our clinical development pipeline. The first one, Orviglance, is a diagnostic drug for a small patient population. It is in a global phase 3 study now. We have an orphan drug designation from the FDA, and we prepare to launch the product in the US end of 23. Oncology is a chemotherapy in a daily formulation, and we are now ready for the phase 2 study for Oncology starting this year. We are well financed into 2023. We're based in Malmö. We have a US office in New Jersey. We are listed on the main exchange in Stockholm. And on the next slide, today we have two compounds in clinical development, one in phase 3. We plan to launch Orviglance in the US and have our first revenue in 2023. And we want to expand our pipeline and build a growing company from there on. On the next slide. So a little bit more about Orviglance. We can move to the next slide. Orviglance is a diagnostic drug to diagnose cancer in the liver. Cancer in the liver is a very common challenge in cancer care. Primary liver cancer affects up to 1 million people a year, but in fact, many cancer types develop liver metastases, and oftentimes liver metastases are the cause of mortality for these patients. The way to diagnose and determine treatment for liver cancer and liver metastases is to do an liver imaging. The gold standard for liver imaging is an MRI. And when you do an MRI, you use a contrast agent. This agent will enhance the picture, so you will have an even clearer look at the liver tissue and will be able to detect and visualize where the cancer is. So we call these focal liver lesions. You will see that later on. But you use an MRI both to detect where the cancer is, and you use it to plan, for example, a surgery, and you will use it as follow-up to a drug or a surgery treatment to see if the cancer has come back. On the next slide. So the way you do an MRI depends a little bit on the kidney function of a patient, because about 12 to 15 years ago, we discovered that the standard contrast agents called gadolinium contrast agents, they are risky to use for patients with severely impaired kidney function. If you have a severely impaired kidney function, this toxic heavy metal may be difficult to secrete from the body. So it will go through the kidneys to be secreted from the body, and you were at risk of developing a side effect called nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. Actually, 25% of the cases reported to the FDA were fatal for these patients. So it's quite a severe side effect, and we don't have a treatment for that today. So all the existing contrast agents in the market, the gadolinium contrast agents, they carry what we call a black box warning for patients with severely impaired kidney function. Our drug, Orviglance, can fulfill the unmet need of providing a better image for these patients. So Orviglance is based on manganese, which is a natural trace element that can be found in food and in nature. And it also has paramagnetic properties. So when we use that, it will be taken up by the healthy liver cells and will create an enhancement of the picture for the physician to see and distinguish the healthy liver cells versus the unhealthy or the sick cancer liver cells. So our ambition is for Orviglance to become the standard contrast agent for patients with severely impaired kidney function. So on the next slide, I have an image with an example of what the liver looks like when you use Orviglance compared to when you do an MRI without a contrast agent. So when you have severely impaired kidney function and you are at risk if you use the gadolinium contrast agent, the standard of care would be an unenhanced MRI. So on the left, you see an unenhanced MRI picture. On the right, you see a picture with enhancement with Orviglance. And you see an example of this lesion or cancer lesion that is not detected on the left side, but is on the right side. The other darker elements on the right side are bile ducts and other things that are not cancerous. And the physician would know that. So on the next slide, we have solid data from our phase 1 and phase 2 studies. We have almost 200 patients with data using Orviglance, comparing it to unenhanced or comparing to a gadolinium contrast agent. We have detected 33% more lesions when using Orviglance compared to an unenhanced MRI. And these endpoints about the border sharpness to detect the lesion and the contrast between the background and the enhancement, those are the endpoints that we have used in phase 1 and phase 2, and we will use in phase 3. And as you can see, we have very low p-values, which gives us confidence in moving forward with the same trial design as we had in phase 1 and phase 2. We do have one study actually comparing Orviglance, an Orviglance image, to an image using a liver-specific gadolinium contrast agent. And in this specific study, where the data was presented orally at the big radiology conference in the US, and also will be presented this summer at the European conference, this showed that out of 3 readers, 2 of them favored Orviglance when it came to lesion visualization. So this is a small study, but it gives us solid data for our discussions with regulatory bodies and also in the future stakeholders that will support commercialization. On the next slide, here's our phase 3 study. Our phase 3 study, because it's an orphan designation and it's a diagnostic drug, is fairly simple comparing to therapeutic drugs in larger studies. So we only have one phase 3 study. It's in 200 patients. It's a global study. These patients have known or suspected cancer in the liver, and they have severe renal impairment. We compare an Orviglance image with an unenhanced image to an unenhanced image alone. And the 2 endpoints, visualization, border delineation, and conspicuity, are the same as the ones we had in our phase 2 study. It's also a simple design because the patient will come in and be recruited and do some initial testing at the site, and then they will do the MRI procedures, and then there'll be some follow-up. Some of these can even be done virtually, which is very helpful in these times. So the status is that we have more than 40 sites recruiting, and we expect to have our readout this year, and with completing the recruitment by end of the first half. So the next slide. A little bit about the commercial potential of Orviglance. The addressable market represents 500 to 600 million in the US, EU, and Japan. We plan to commercialize Orviglance on our own in the US. It is by far the market with the biggest potential When we succeed in the US, we succeed capturing and retaining the value of Orviglance. In European markets and other global markets such as Japan, our plan is to work with a partner, which allows us to focus on the US and allow these partners to use their synergies and experience in the local markets. So the drivers behind this estimate, they are exactly the same as the patient population from the phase 3 study. It's patients with suspected liver cancer in the liver and with severe kidney impairment. And the severe kidney impairment in this type of patient population represents around 4% of the people with suspected cancer in the liver. We have data supporting our estimates from real-world data, sort of claims data, as we call it, a database of actual procedures, mainly from the US. And we have collected input from payers and policy stakeholders where we have tested price points for Orviglance, and we have input to what kind of evidence they will ask from us to support this price point and support reimbursement. These forecasts do not estimate, do not include, for example, the rest of Europe outside the EU, China, other global markets, and they do not include any life cycle management or label expansions. So this is purely for the phase 3 study in the US, Europe, and Japan. On the next slide, our plans for launching in the US are quite interesting because it allows us to focus on the bigger hospitals. Patients with these kind of complications are typically found already in cancer care at larger hospitals. So when we look at this data, we can see that around 2,000 radiologists at 400 accounts in the US are the main drivers of this market potential. That allows us to launch with a focus team of account managers, sales team, medical access. A focus team that would add up to an affiliate in the US of around 40 FTEs. Some of these will be the back office support, and most of these will be working in the field. We are gradually building our footprint in the US as part of our launch preparations. One footprint is that our manufacturing partner for the global manufacturing, a third party, is in the US, also in New Jersey, Cambridge. And we also have many of our investigators in the phase 3 study at the leading hospitals in the US. Preparations for launch are focused on building a network and relationships and insights into how these main clinics in the US would make a decision around Orviglance when it's available and has been approved by the FDA. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about Oncoral. So Oncoral is a daily chemotherapy. We can move to the next one. Yeah, Oncoral is a daily formulation of a well-known chemotherapy, irinotecan. Irinotecan today is formulated as an IV intravenous infusion and is used every 3 weeks. When you have these high infusions, as many of us know and have seen from relatives or friends undergoing cancer treatment often also leads to some severe side effects. And oftentimes there's a trade-off between the efficacy of the treatment and the tolerability of the treatment. Oncoral is a daily formulation, so it's a tablet of irinotecan. So by having this daily formulation, we have the potential of a, so you could say, more consistent, flatter exposure to the body, which will help us alleviate this trade-off between efficacy and tolerability. And our aim is to improve both the efficacy and the tolerability for these patients. So on the next slide, here's a little bit of data behind this concept. So if you look at the charts here, the gray one, which would be the high infusion volume every 3 weeks, that is often associated with gastrointestinal side effects, with hematological side effects, and many of these are severe or even life-threatening. So there's data supporting various types of what we call metronomic dosing, so lower dosing and more frequent dosing. That is known from other studies for other compounds, but not yet has a daily irinotecan been developed or commercialized. But if we look at some of the conceptual data around metronomic dosing, several studies show improved tolerability. And also it allows this daily dosing, it allows a patient to withdraw from therapy if needed because of some of the side effects. From our phase 1 studies, we have solid data supporting us moving ahead into phase 2. It was well tolerated, no unexpected side effects. The hematological toxicities were mild or moderate. And also in terms of efficacy, we saw a stable disease even for patients that had been previously treated on the IV formulation. So on the next slide, a little bit more about the potential for efficacy of a more frequent treatment. This is from a cancer therapy with 100 patients where irinotecan was injected, so IV every 3 weeks, the standard, compared that to an injection every week. This data is over 18 months, and we see the overall survival of these patients going up from 20% to 32%. So we aim to see not only that the daily formulation of irinotecan with Oncoral will improve the tolerability, but because of this daily exposure, we can also improve the efficacy. So on the next slide, we are starting in gastric cancer. Gastric cancer is a cancer type with an unmet need, high unmet need because the diagnosis is often quite late and the life expectancy for patients quite poor. Clinical guidelines support the use of irinotecan in gastric cancer, but it is not yet approved, which gives us the opportunity for this very small patient population to have an orphan drug designation. We also found, and you would typically start in a combination therapy when you commercialize and develop a new cancer compound or a new cancer therapy. So we found an oral cancer therapy used for gastric cancer, Lonsurf. And we found data supporting that there might be a synergistic effect between Lonsurf and Oncoral. So on the right side, if you can see, on my screen, my picture is in the way, but on the lowest black line with the triangles is a combination of using IV irinotecan, so the standard irinotecan and Lonsurf. And we saw that the tumor size, the relative tumor size, was smaller for this combination than any of these alone. So that gave us an indication that there is a synergistic effect, and we wanted to move forward with Oncoral and gastric cancer. So on the next slide, our phase 2 study is around 100 patients. It is this combination with Lonsurf. And the endpoint is progression-free survival. We have entered into a clinical collaboration with the company owning this asset, Lonsurf, Taiho Oncology, which is part of a big Japanese group, and they will supply the product for the clinical trial. So on the next slide, so while starting in gastric cancer, we have the opportunity to expand beyond gastric cancer. So all of these other cancer types either have irinotecan used in clinical practice off-label, or it's recognized in the clinical guidelines, or both. So starting in gastric cancer is attractive because there's an unmet need and an opportunity for an orphan designation. But we are looking into the next steps and other indications for Oncoral. So on the next slide, we can move forward to the last one in terms of the next one after this. In terms of financials, we're well funded into 2023. We have a burn rate of around 30 to 35 million Swedish per quarter. So we can move to the last slide in summary. I can see my time is almost up. So the priorities for this year is to complete our phase 3 study, to prepare the commercialization for Orviglance, and to start the phase 2 study for Oncology. So that was it from me. I'm looking forward to your questions, Ludwig.
Yes, thank you very much, Julie, for a great presentation. You touched on it briefly in your presentation, but can you again just clarify why you believe this is a low-risk phase 3 study compared to, say, the average oncology phase 3 study?
So the first starting point is that the data from our phase 1 and phase 2 studies show quite consistent results. So the design is that we compare to unenhanced MRI, and we need to show a significant improvement of the image compared to unenhanced MRI. Usually, that gives an opportunity to really have that improvement, where sometimes you go head to head to something that is more a direct, you can say, competitor. We don't have to do that, because for this patient population, the standard of care is an unenhanced MRI, and that is what we have agreed with the FDA. So the results are also very, very consistent. As you saw, the p-values are very low. We take the same study format into our phase 3 study. And the other part, which is interesting, you could say, I don't know if it's related to risk, but you could say in a pandemic time, for an emerging pharma company, it's nice to have a trial, a phase 3 trial with 200 patients, where the total involvement for the patient is around 1 week. That's quite different from a longer period of therapy and a period of follow-up. So it's a very simple design, limited patients, and it's based on very solid results from our phase 1 and phase 2 studies.
Right. And your goal is still to be fully recruited this half of the year, right?
It is. That is our plan.
Yeah, and then you will patients will be followed up for 5 days.
Yeah, that is within for every patient. There's whenever they are recruited, whether that was a patient from last year or from now, for every patient there's about 1 week involvement in the study.
Right, right. And then how long time do you believe it will take from the last patient has been followed up until you can actually present data? Are we talking 2 months, or could you give any sort of?
Yeah, we have decided not to be too specific about this, but of course we don't need a long sort of follow-up as if you had a therapy and you needed to have long-term data. So it takes the time that it takes to finish the reading. So the reading of these images is done by 3 independent readers. So they see all the pictures in a big mix randomly. So I think we've said that takes at least some months. Yeah.
Right, right. And you were very clear from the start that you were gonna go alone in the US and build your own commercial infrastructure. But did you even consider going to Europe alone, or was this never an option?
I mean, it's our responsibility to evaluate the options and have a strategy based and define a strategy based on what we think is best for the company and for our stakeholders and shareholders. And so we have, of course, looked at the different options. This makes a lot of sense because the US is by far the biggest potential. So it's both to, you could say, allow us to focus on the US, where the biggest value is. As we know, the margins for a drug in the US are usually higher than in Europe because of pricing. And so it allows us to focus on where the value is. But you can say for a lot of European markets, they are also in different in some of their reimbursement and pricing settings, so it makes sense to work with a team already in place in different European markets and other markets beyond that.
Right, yeah, it makes sense. And in terms of gross margins for Orviglance, could you say anything about ballpark where you expect to be, so to say? How much does it cost it to produce, and how much will it cost? What is your estimated margin over time?
And that's another good reason why this is a really attractive opportunity for us, because it is a well-defined small patient population, so we can target a significant premium to the gadolinium contrast agents, which is what we have tested, and that is the feedback we have from payers, because they don't have an alternative, they are at risk, and it's a well-defined patient population. So that premium allows us to have quite an attractive margin. We haven't communicated the details, but it's more of a sort of a biotech benchmark than certainly it is a gadolinium contrast agent benchmark. So those benchmarks as a standard at launch are probably more around 5-10%. Maybe a bit more. I mean, Europe prices are lower, so it looks a little different, but very attractive and nothing like the gadolinium contrast agents.
Great. And then I wanted to round this up with talking a bit about Oncology, your other project, and the collaboration that you have with Taiho Oncology. Where do you hope this will take you, so to say, and what is it in for Taiho to do this kind of collaboration with you?
So first of all, what we really hope is that this will help us have really strong outcomes for the phase 2 study, because this is an ideal kind of combination in the sense that they're both oral, and that we have an indication of some synergistic effect, and they have an approved use in gastric cancer. So you can say there's really an ideal opportunity here to show strong outcomes. That is our main target. And where it could lead us, you know, who knows? If it goes well, of course, that can be promising for both parties. But I mean, we have to look at optimizing the value for Oncoral globally, and for other potential future indications, other combinations, ideally with a TAP and oral drug. So we're also looking into other potential future developments and combinations. But and then you asked, what's in it for them, I think. Yeah. What is interesting for them is that if you're looking at, and I can't speculate, they would have to answer themselves, but if you look at their pipeline and portfolio, they have quite a lot of oncology drugs that are tablets, daily formulations and tablets. So that is a strategy for them. Also, they have had the approval in gastric cancer fairly recently, and most cancer drugs, when you are in second, third line treatment, are combinations. So it's interesting for them to also have other future combinations. So we see some wins on both sides, and we hope to build on that.
Okay, sounds exciting, Julie. Time is running out, so thank you for participating, and see you soon again.
Thank you so much, and have a good day.
You too.
Yeah.